problems in. Now, I'm going to first read Professor Milani's biography, and then I'm going to tell you a little story, and then I'm going to let him speak, because he didn't come to hear me. And that is, Professor Milani is a quite well-known Iranian intellectual who has written books all the way from Malraux to a Persian memoir, to a book about Abbas Milani, to rethinking Persian modernity, to the great myth of the great Satan, a new look at America's relations with Iran, and lastly a biography which I had great pleasure in reading on the Shah. And I thought this was a very illuminating biography to tell us what happened in modern Iranian history. Now, before I let Professor Milani speak, I want to tell you my story, which was I was recently at a conference in Berlin, and this story was told by a famous Islamist in Berlin, and he claimed that it was a true story. How he knew it, I don't know. And that was this, that Khamenei was talking to Ahmadinejad, and he said to him, "You know who the greatest enemy is of the Islamic Republic?" So Ahmadinejad said, "The great Satan," that means the United States. And Khamenei said, "No." So he said, "Well, I assume you mean the little Satan, that's us, in Israel." And he said, "No, our greatest enemy is Jürgen Habermas." Those were the quote, Jürgen Habermas. Now, I think that's a very interesting proposition, because what it means is this, whether true or not, that the mullahs in Iran are highly educated people who are completely up to date on Western thinking about the subject of democracy. And they know, and their greatest enemy, in their view, is nothing other than the relativity of values and the idea of an open modern society. They're against it for deep ideological reasons, and the idea that you can create a state together with them unless they stop believing what they believe is, I think, a contentious idea. So, with those words, I want to welcome Professor Abbas Milani to speak to us on exactly this, the prospects and problems of democracy in Iran. So, Professor Milani, please.
Good evening. I'm sorry I don't speak Hebrew. I speak Persian. It's close to Hebrew. Salam arz mukaram. Tashakkur. Some of it sounds like Hebrew. I have to thank Professor Moghadam for the wonderful invitation. When he was at Stanford, I saw some of the work that Van Leer Institute was trying to do. It was truly a noble effort to try to find a common language with Jewish intellectuals, Palestinian intellectuals, about how to talk about what has happened in this part of the world. It was really one of the most remarkable conferences I have been to, and the minute that he talked about me coming to Van Leer Institute, I was privileged and I couldn't wait to come. It's taken a year and a half to come, and I have to say the welcome at the airport was truly royal. There was a car that actually took me, it says royal welcome, and I don't think they were exaggerating. And I'm just hoping that leaving will be the same royal departure. If it is, you're going to see me come here often, because it's not anywhere else where you can go through the airport as quickly as I went this time. I want to also thank Professor Anat Frilla for helping the logistics and deciding on the topic and organizing a seminar, and of course Ms. Shulamit, who has been truly gracious in arranging all the logistics. The story about Habermas is not completely apocryphal. Last year, about 2.5 years ago, the regime, as some of you know, put about 100 of its leaders on trial for organizing the Green Movement. It was truly a reminiscent of Stalinist show trials of the 30s. And in the indictment, of course, I and Stanford University was named as one of the co-conspirators. They said the idea of democracy has been germinating there. They named Mike McFaul, my friend and colleague, who's now the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and Larry Diamond, who I'm sure some of you know, who's worked on democracy, as the three masterminds of the Green Movement. And they named me as the CIA bagman. They say all the money that went to Iran went through me. And as I keep telling my friends, if any of you need some money, I have a few million left, just send an application. But in that trial, one of the people who was put on trial was a man named Saeed Hajjarian. Some of you might know him. He was for many years the deputy director of the intelligence ministry. He was one of the masterminds of the regime's intelligence ministry. And he later became very much a la Soviet Union, convinced, like the KGB became convinced in Soviet Union, that the regime can't continue as it is. So he became a mastermind of the reform movement. Then he was the subject of an assassination attempt by the right wing. He survived that assassination attempt. And then he was put on trial as one of the conspirators. And in the trial, he read this really remarkable sort of confessional, Stalinist confessional. He said, yes, you're right, I was wrong, I didn't see the dangers of my way, but I'm not really responsible. The real person responsible is Western sociology. It's Max Weber, Habermas. And it's you who allowed us to get educated. If you don't want us to rebel, don't let us get educated. Now, if that is a true statement, and I think he was being ironically truthful, the regime has a lot of trouble on its hands. As we speak, Iran has over 2.5 million students who are studying social sciences. 2.5 million. There are 4 million college students in Iran. 65% of graduate degrees in science and engineering in Iran are by women. And Iranian women have been at the forefront of the democratic struggle for the last 35 years. There is no force that has fought this regime more systematically, more cleverly, more relentlessly, and in some ways more successfully than women have. And now they're 65%, 64% of all the graduate degrees in sciences. So all of this, to me, indicates that the state of the struggle in Iran, of democracy in Iran, is not as bad as you might otherwise think. So what I'm going to try to do is tell you a little bit about where I think the democratic movement is in Iran, what its prospects are, and what its problems are. I'm going to do my best not to talk about the nuclear issue, but I'm sure it will come up, and in anticipation, I'll try to end my talk by relating the democratic issue. Let me just say here that I truly believe, and I've said this for many, many years now, that the only possible long-term enduring solution to Iran's nuclear problem is for a democratic Iran. No regime, unless a democratic regime in Iran can be a dependable partner in any kind of a negotiation. Anything short of a democratic, transparent, law-abiding government in Iran is not going to be able to make the kinds of agreements that will be enduring. But we'll get to that in a minute. Iran is, in a sense, I think, a very paradoxical country, maybe the most paradoxical in the Muslim world. It has today a government that legally is the most authoritarian, despotic government, I think, anywhere. There might be more authoritarian despots, but there is nowhere where in the Constitution as much power is given to one man as Mr. Khamenei has in Iran. There is nowhere, even I think Putin's Russia, where one man controls as much money that he does not give any accounting to as Iran. Reuters' recent report that said Mr. Khamenei controls close to $95 billion in assets, and that he absolutely does not give any reporting about this. These are assets that belong to God, and he, as God's representative, has absolute control over them. And I have to tell you that the Reuters accounting was not overly optimistic. I think the actual figure, if you add some of the other endowments that weren't even mentioned there, is larger. So he controls an enormous amount of wealth. And this is the amount of wealth that he controls on paper. The amount of wealth that he controls indirectly, in the sense of the ability of making people billionaire or millionaire overnight, is remarkable. Again, there are several examples. A young man by the name of Babak Zanjani, who became a friend of the regime several years ago, and in the span of less than 15 years is now said to own $19 billion worth of assets, almost all of it gained illegally. So he controls an enormous amount of financial assets legally. He controls an enormous amount of financial prowess illegally, and he controls a disproportionate amount of power on paper. He is the commander-in-chief. He appoints the head of the judiciary. He appoints the head of the television. He appoints 6 of the 12 people who essentially act as the Iran's Supreme Court. He appoints the head of the IRGC. He controls all of the endowments. He appoints the heads of the endowments. And these are, he is in charge of foreign policy overall. Again, if you haven't paid attention, you wouldn't know that Iranian elections, even the controlled elections, are essentially consultative. He has to appoint the president every year, every election year. Once someone gets the majority, he issues an order that says, upon the vote, consultative vote of the people, I appoint you the president. The Persian word is tanfiz. It's an Arabic, actually, word. And when Rouhani, the last president, was elected, many of the clergy close to Khamenei made it very clear. They said, the vote of the people really doesn't count much. If the leader doesn't like you, he can pull the plug on you anytime. So that's what he controls on paper. That's what the law allows him. The Constitution, however, is part of the paradox that I said Iran is. On the one hand, the Constitution affords sovereignty only to God. It affords the disproportionate share of power to this man, to this one man, unelected, unimpeachable. As again, some of his cronies said, he's not even elected by those who elected him. He is discovered the way a Buddha is discovered. It's a divine presence, it's a divine wisdom, and somehow the rest of us mere mortals discovered in him, and thus he who has anointed him can unanoint him. In other words, people have no right in that. But this is one side of this paradoxical constitution. On the other side of this constitution are elections, where people have the right to elect the president, who doesn't have that much power, but still has some power. It has some control of the budget. Maybe 25-30% of the budget is directly controlled by him. It has the ability to represent or present Iran. He has the ability to change the tone and texture of conversation, if not the content of the discussion. There are elections to parliament, and there is a parliament. Iran has had regular elections now for 34 years. And this election aspect, this Republican aspect, emanates from the fact that the 1979 revolution was actually a democratic revolution hijacked by Ayatollah Khomeini. I think there is, in my mind, no mistake about it. The 1979 revolution was a revolution made not for the rule of the clergy. And to give you an example, Ayatollah Khomeini, in the 3.5 months before the election, when he was in Paris, when he came to public international attention, gave something like 110 interviews. Not once in those interviews did he mention the word velayat faqih, which means the rule of the Jurist Council, which is the system we have in Iran today, which is the system that says people have no role, God is the sole sovereign, and God anoints someone as the 12th Imam's successor. Iranians are predominantly Shiites. They're a predominantly 12er form of Shiites. That means they believe in 12 Imams. The 12th Imam has gone into hiding. He will return. He is the Messiah. He is the Mahdi. It's a concept that has come from Zoroastrianism, borrowed some aspects of Christianity. And in that absence, in that occultation, he always has, according to Ayatollah Khomeini's theory, some representative. That representative was Ayatollah Khomeini when he was alive. He is now Khamenei, and he doesn't need the vote of the people. He is sovereign by choice of God. So you have a republican idea that is based on popular sovereignty, that's based on the modern notion that governments are legitimate if they arise out of the will of the people. You have a government that is essentially, in the modern theory, a social contract. It arises out of the will, the desire of the people. We elect them, and we can unelect them. We can throw out the bums if we don't like them and bring in a new group of bums to rule. That's what democracy means. It doesn't mean laws are divine. It doesn't mean laws are acceptable because of their origins, or a ruler is acceptable because of his origin. So you had these two incongruent concepts forged together in the 1979 Constitution. And Ayatollah Khomeini very cleverly, realizing that the movement that he had come to lead was a democratic movement, said nothing about his intention to create a judicial rule of a jurist regime in Iran. He had written about it in 1970, 71. He had given lectures about it, but he absolutely made no mention of it. In fact, he said repeatedly things to the contrary. He's repeatedly said, in the next government, the clergy will have no role. He said, I will myself become a simple seminarian. I will go to Qom. He said, I will not allow the clergy to have any role in any decision-making, top decision-making governmental position. And for a while, he held to that. But once in Iran, he changed his tune. Once in Iran, the first draft of the Constitution was changed. You had a new Constitution drafted, which did not talk about the Republican ideas that it had before, but now talked about the rule of the Jurist Council. But at the same time, because it was a movement that had arisen from the democratic aspirations of the people in 1979, you got this paradoxical constitution, this incongruent constitution that is republican and Islamic, that is divine, sovereign, God governed on the one hand, and people's chosen election on the other. Although the clergy eventually even controlled the electoral process by putting in a vetting process, by making sure that no candidate can get on a ballot unless the clergy approve. But nevertheless, you have these two concepts, a republican idea and a clerical idea, a clerical absolutism based on divine sovereignty, and a half-baked republicanism based on popular sovereignty. That's why Iran hasn't seen essentially political stability for the last 34 years. Iran has been, in a sense, in a state of constant political crisis, in my view, for the last 34 years. In a sense, you can go back and say that for the last 150 years, Iran has been facing a very serious political crisis. Since 150 years, from 1850 to 1979, no king in Iran died on the throne peacefully except one. Everybody else was either executed or exiled. The one person that died peacefully on the throne was the one who gave up much of his power and wrote the constitutional of 1905-07. Iran has been trying to have a democratic government since 1905-1907. Iran has one of the oldest democratic movements in the Islamic world. Iran's movement in 1905-1907 inspired partly from what was happening in Turkey, partly from what was happening in Russia, partly from people coming back from Europe, was trying to create a democratic government. They wrote a very democratic constitution in 1907. Iran had one of the first democratic constitutions of a Muslim country anywhere. But democracy is not having a democratic constitution. Democracy requires a social fabric. Democracy requires social habits. Democracy requires a middle class. Democracy requires recognition of equality before the law. In 1905-07, when they tried to write a democratic constitution, they faced the fact that the Shiite clergy were unwilling to accept that the life of a woman was equal to the life of a man. According to Islamic Sharia, the life of a woman is worth half of the life of a man. The life of a Christian, a Jew, a Zoroastrian is worth half of the life of a man. The life of a member of a Baha'i faith is virtually worthless because it's not even valued. And to say, because in the Quran it says the life of a woman is worth half of the life of a man, that there is equality before the law was a problem for them. But even once they tried to transcend that problem by saying that people are equal before governmental laws rather than before the law, in reality, that equality was not forthcoming. In reality, democracy was not forthcoming. Iran had a virtual failed state from 1907 to 1921. And then you had from 1921 to 1979 a very strong process, a very speedy process of what we would call authoritarian modernization during the Pahlavi era. Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza Shah began a process to modernize Iran very quickly. In essence, began to create the foundational institutions that you need for a democracy. That is, they began to create a middle class. They began to create a modern secular education system. They began to accept the fact that women must be part of the political, economic, social, intellectual process. Reza Shah began modernization very much in the spirit he found in Turkey. In 1941, his son came to power and essentially followed that process, very much the same as his father, with one big difference. Reza Shah was very clear that if Iran was to modernize, religion, particularly Shiite clergy, have to be driven off the public domain into the private domain. Religion must become the private affair of the people. Clergy must not be able to control the education system as they had till then. They must not be able to control the judiciary as they had till then. Reza Shah secularized the judiciary, secularized the education system, took away the economic foundation of clerical power. And he was to a great extent successful. His son came in 41 and essentially followed the father's model with one major exception. He decided that in fighting his enemies, and he thought his main enemy were the communists, he thought that in fighting his secondary enemies, and that was the nationalists, the clergy were his allies. So from 41 to 79, and I've described this in some detail, and in some shocking detail. When I began doing the research for it, I was truly shocked by it myself. The Shah modernized Iran. The Shah's authoritarianism increased. The Shah's ability to rule with an iron fist increased as the price of oil increased. The rate of change in Iran increased. Iran witnessed one of the largest migrations in its 2,500-year history. That is migration from the countryside to the city. That is the end of feudalism and the beginning of essentially a state form of capitalism. The last two presidents of Iran, Rouhani and Mr. Ahmadinejad, both are children of the movement that I'm talking about, the movement from 1960 to 1970, from the countryside to the city. Iran was in 1941, 80 to 85% a village-based society. In 1979, it was a 50 or 60%, depending on how you define a village. So you've had millions of people converge onto the cities. You had millions of conservative villagers come to the cities, expecting a great civilization as the Shah promised. But there was only one political force allowed to mobilize and allowed to organize them, and that was the clergy. The clergy were allowed to mobilize with virtually no limit. And Khomeini and the rest of the clergy began to lay the foundations from late 50s of a remarkable network. As I've begun to look at this network, its subtlety, its multifacetedness, its dynamic structure, its ability to use everything from Islamic terrorism that they learned, and they were in direct communication with Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt, from that form of radicalism to the most subtle apolitical form of organization, like organizing Sunday or Friday Quranic reading sessions, from having their own schools. Mr. Rouhani was picked in 1959 as a talented young student and put in one of these special schools that trained cadres with an Islamic proclivity. It is a remarkable structure, and nobody paid any attention to it. The CIA was oblivious to it. The Shah's secret police was oblivious to it. Mossad seemed to be oblivious to it. The Shah and his secret police actually believed that it is a good thing that the Islamic forces are organizing and are increasing. They encouraged it. They fought the radicals, but the rest of it they allowed to grow. The rest of it they believed was the antidote needed for communism. Now, to give Shah some credit, the Americans made the same mistake after the 1979 revolution in Afghanistan. Even after 79, they still believed that Muslim radicals are a useful antidote to communism. In Iran, the result was that when the system went into crisis, when the middle classes demanded a share of political pie, when the new educated people began to say they wanted a more democratic polity, the only force that could hold the country together, the only force, as Khomeini wrote a letter in 79 to Jimmy Carter, he said, what do you want from Iran? You want a government to hold out the communists, to sell oil, and hold the country together. We're the only force that can do that. And the American embassy was gullible enough, and the Iranian intellectuals were gullible enough, and the Iranian left was gullible enough to believe that. But this is the bad news. The good news is that all the forces that brought about the 1979 revolution, that is the student movement, the middle class movement, the women's movement, the labor movement, the Iranian secular intellectuals, all of these forces, while defeated in 1979, have not died. They have been strengthened. They have continued to grow, where today we have one of the most vibrant Iranian civil societies under the very nose of the regime that has tried to kill it. We have one of the most vibrant women's movements under the very nose of the regime that tried to do with Iranian women what the Taliban tried to do and did successfully to women in Afghanistan. Iranian women fought and have kept on fighting. The Iranian democratic movement today, in my view, has to be seen not just in the purely political sense. People are fighting this regime in ways that are different than a simple political demonstration in the street, although they're doing that. But they are finding ways to fight this regime in much, much more subtle ways. Iran, in my view, is undergoing a renaissance, a revival at the societal level, not at the regime level. That's one of the paradoxical aspects. You have one of the most reactionary, septuagenarian, male-dominated regimes ruling a society that is 3/5 under the age of 30. A society that has 30 to 35 million internet users. That is a remarkable fact of, I don't think outside Israel there is any country that has as many internet savvy users as Iran, as many webloggers as Iran, as many Facebook, although the regime considers membership in Facebook counter-revolutionary. Today I was reading that one of the conservatives said membership in the Facebook and chat rooms is a Zionist conspiracy because it is cultivating, really, it was wonderful. It says in these chat rooms and in Facebooks, men and women actually hear each other's voices and they show each other's pictures, and this is a Zionist conspiracy to undermine Islamic values. In spite of it being a Zionist conspiracy, everybody is doing it. Iran is, there is a couple of books written about this. There is a very short article written about it. Iran is even experiencing a sexual revolution. Under the nose of the most puritanical regime, Iran right now is experiencing probably one of its most, in some ways dangerously, libertarian sexual movements. The article in Foreign Policy calls Iran the erotic Republic of Iran, not the Islamic Republic of Iran. Reports about women's activities in the economic sector, in the artistic sector, in poetry, in publishing, in political domain is remarkable in spite of what the regime is trying to do. The regime, again, began by changing the average age, the legal age of marriage to 9 for women. 9. That's Sharia. There is a hadith, there's a saying of the Prophet that says, happy is the man whose daughter does not see her period in his father's house, is married off before that. They changed the law. The first law Ayatollah Khomeini changed was the family law and made the family law completely commensurate with Sharia. You know what the actual age of marriage for a woman is? 24. So people are not doing what the Sharia tells them to do. Although women have fought, and now the legal age has been raised to 14, but the actual age is 24. They just passed a law 3-4 weeks ago that said a stepfather is legally entitled, under certain circumstances, to marry his stepdaughter. Stepfather is legally allowed, under circumstances, to marry his stepdaughter. Women's group have been fighting this enormously effectively. They just got one clergy to issue a fatwa against the government law that said it's okay. He issued a fatwa saying that it is not okay. So the women's movement is one aspect, to me the most important aspect. But look at music, look at theater, look at art, look at poetry, look at publishing, look at the magazines that come out of Iran. All of them. Look at websites, look at weblogs, look at what people actually read. I was telling Professor Muskin about the fact that the regime banned my book on the Shah. I put it on the internet for free download in Iran. And in the first 6 weeks, we had 60,000 people reading the book. An average run of a book in Iran right now is 2,000 when it's printed copy. But the people, in order to, spite the regime, are finding ways. We showed a film at Stanford, it's called My City Pizza. It's about the prevalence of pizza in Tehran. And, Persian food, some of you might have had it here, some of you are from Iran, I know. Persian food is wonderful cuisine. It's labor intensive, but it's wonderful. But people are eating pizza, and they go to these rooms and they ask people, why are you eating pizza? It says, the regime doesn't want us to eat pizza. We eat pizza to spite the regime. In other words, even eating habits are becoming a form of this political process. When you have a regime that tries to control every facet of your life, it tries to decide how you dress, who you talk to. Khomeini just issued a fatwa saying talking to Baha'is, dealing with Baha'is is against the law. When you have a regime that tries to control in a pseudo-totalitarian fashion every aspect of your life, then every aspect of your life becomes a tool of dissent. I teach a course every 2 years at Stanford. It's called Aesthetics of Dissent. And we talk about how when you politicize everything, everything becomes also a tool of dissent. So when I appear on Persian I don't wear ties, except when I go to Van Leer Institute, or when I appear on television, particularly when I appear on television going to Iran, because the Iranian regime says this is a remnant of the crusade. It said this is really a cross, and anyone who wears it is participating in a westernization. So if wearing a tie is saying no to the regime, there are infinite ways of saying no. That's where, in my view, the democratic movement in Iran has been putting an enormous amount of sophistication in finding ways to fight this regime, and fight it in a way that does not lead to another revolution. The Iranian youth are much wiser than my generation. Our generation was the children of the Cold War. We were ideological. We were driven by a kind of view that saw the world in black and white. The Shah was evil. The Shah was a CIA creation. We must get rid of him. We had a very warped view of what democracy meant. We thought democracy literally meant the right to curse the Shah and criticize the Shah. If you didn't have the right to criticize the Shah, there was no democracy. When the youth now look at Iran, and when we look back at the Shah period, we see that in many, many, many aspects, Iran had an enormous amount of cultural, economic, religious, sexual, moral, artistic democracy in that period. Jews in Iran, according to David Menasheri, one of the most renowned Israeli scholars about the fate of Jews in Iran, he says the Pahlavi era was the golden era of Iranian Jewry. The per capita average income of Iranian Jews, he said at that time, was probably the highest anywhere in the world. Iran had at the time 125,000 Jews in Iran, probably the largest of any Muslim society in the world. The fact that the Baha'is had more or less economic freedom, that some of the greatest industries in Iran were built by Jews or Baha'is. The fact that there was artistic experimentation, the fact that you could live your private life the way you wanted to and the government would not interfere, was not accepted as part of the as part of the democratic cultural realities of Iran. This generation is not as absolutist as we are. They're not ideological. They're not looking for a messiah. They're not looking for a general or a military man or a clergy to come. In fact, they determine for themselves what the future of Iran is going to be. That's why, in my view, and I'm going to finish in 3 minutes because we want to have some time for a question and answer. That's why, in my view, the regime in Iran is politically a corpse. Iranian society has already jettisoned this era. It has jettisoned the idea of despotism. It has rejected the idea that one man can speak for God. It has jettisoned the idea that one man knows the welfare of a society better than society. It has completely jettisoned the idea that woman's life is worth half the life of a man. There are idiots in Iran who might still believe that. But Iranian society at large, in my view, it has jettisoned the idea that Iranian tradition is all bad or all good. Iranian music, Iranian theater, Iranian painting is taking tradition and fusing it with the best of the West in a remarkably creative way. That's why the system, in my view, this autocratic, despotic regime that is trying to build a model society based on what was in Arabia in 1400 years ago, is a political corpse. But it's a political corpse that has some political power still. It has oil money. It has, at least in my view, 10 to 15% of the population that's supported. And as it has shown in Syria, as it has shown in Iran, as it has shown in Lebanon, it is willing to use the 10-15%. It is willing to use that oil money with absolute violent abandon in order to preserve itself. So it is a corpse that is surviving in spite of the fact that society has already jettisoned it. So to me, and we can talk in the question and answer if you have an interest in that, the election of Rouhani was really at least partially the result of this process, rather than a simple attempt by Khamenei to bypass a critical regime, a critical moment. The regime is in a very critical moment. The nuclear issue is very much related to its fortunes, but as I said, I'm not going to talk about the nuclear issue unless you ask me about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Milani. That leaves us time for lots of questions and lots of answers. Let's see, I'm going to put myself down first, and then Richard, and then this gentleman over here. And just a second, there are a lot of people. Then Tom, then this gentleman, and then this gentleman. And I think we'll do that for the first round of questions. You can either address each question individually, or you can decide to group them as you wish. Okay. Just tell me which you prefer, since we do have some time. Look, it's all very nice, and it's nice to think of this as a corpse, but I have the following problem, which is that if I look at when regimes collapse, and I look at France in 1789, or I look at Russia in 1989, then the key factor is the East German factor, which is when the elites of the regime cease to believe in it, because that's when they don't fire on the population anymore. It isn't that they've given up their power, it's somebody walks up to them and puts a flower in the gun, and suddenly the soldier is standing there and he doesn't know what to do. That's when you know that the regime has lost. Now, it strikes me that Iran has a sophisticated system through its two armies, through the clergy and everything else, of keeping this belief alive. Do you see any signs by which the ruling class itself has begun to weaken in its support of its ideology?
I think that's an excellent question. It raises two issues. One is the elite, and the other one referred to, I think, Germany. One aspect of this democratic transition that I was trying to wrap up and I didn't mention is the Iranian diaspora. I'll get to that after I answer your question. I actually do see signs of precisely that kind of rift. If you look at the history of this regime, I think it's fair to say that there are three people who were the master architects of this structure: Khomeini, and Rafsanjani. If we want to put them in the order of significance, it's Khomeini, Rafsanjani, and Khamenei. These are the three architects. And when Khomeini dies, Rafsanjani and Khamenei become essentially two dual architects of the regime. And for the first few years, Rafsanjani had even more power than Khamenei. There is now an open rift between these two pillars. Khomeini is supposed to have said in his deathbed that this regime will last so long as Rafsanjani and Khamenei are together. Well, they're not together. They're not at each other's throat publicly, but they're at each other's throat metaphorically. Rafsanjani has seen that his future, if there is to be a future for him, is to no longer align himself with Khamenei. He's distancing himself. Many of the Revolutionary Guard commanders are now part of those who are criticizing the system, not out of anything other than self-preservation. The ideological core of the IRGC, in my view, is completely collapsed. The IRGC is now a corporation that has enormous economic interests, a corporation that is probably even more economically important than the Egyptian military is in Egypt's economic. Some estimates that say that it controls about 40% of the Iranian economy. Many of them are interested more in the preservation of their profit than preservation of their ideology. The regime itself keeps saying that we have lost the ideological war, that we have lost the ideological edge. So I think there is some serious rifts within the regime. Again, I said every king in Iran since 1850 either was killed or, except one, or died in exile. Every president in the Islamic Republic of Iran since 1979 has either been killed, exiled, or is now considered as a member of the opposition by Khamenei. The only exception is Khamenei himself, who was the president. Every other president, from Rafsanjani to Khatami to Ahmadinejad, is considered. Next week, Ahmadinejad is to go to court. Today, we hear from the current administration that during the 8-year Ahmadinejad presidency, out of about $700 billion in oil revenue, $150 billion are missing. I mean, that is an enormous sum. More importantly, it's an enormous admission by a regime that my previous administration has taken about a fifth of the entire oil revenue. And folks, to put that in historical perspective, the last 8 years, this regime has had about $700 billion in oil revenue. From day one, when oil was discovered in Iran, Iran has had $1.1 to $1.3 trillion. So it's about 60 or 70% of the entire oil revenue in Iran. And of that, 1/4 of it, now the regime says, is missing. It never showed up in the government coffers. Is that a sign of rift within the regime? Yes. But you're, again, absolutely right. When I say it's a corpse, I don't mean that it's going tomorrow. This is a regime that is going to fight. And when you have 10%, 15% of the population that has made billions, and they know their survival, financial gain, their economic survival, their social status is dependent on this regime, they're going to fight for this regime. It's not going to be an easy process. The other aspect of the, I was supposed to talk about problems and prospects. Another aspect of the problem is that in this effort to jettison the regime, Iranian society has arrived at some serious social problems. Iran has minimally 4 million, some put the figure as high as 7.5 million regular dope addicts. Coke, crack, heroin, and opium. That's almost 10% of the population. What is the democratic Iran going to do with that population? It is not going to be easy. Everybody thinks they can take a bribe. There is a level of corruption that has become endemic. There is a nihilism that has become. All of that is serious. But what might help us transition this period is the diaspora. Again, Iran has never in its history seen as much exile as in the last 35 years. For Jews, diaspora was part of their history. For Iran, it wasn't. It is now very much part of our history. We now have minimally 4.5 million. That is 1 out of every 10 Iranian at the time this regime came to power now lives abroad. That would mean, if you put it in American perspective, if there are 30 million Americans suddenly leave Iran, and 30 million of whom the great majority are the best educated. The Iranian diaspora is now one of the most successful diasporas in America. It is economically, intellectually, scientifically, managerially very capable. It is estimated to control about $700 billion in assets, from eBay to Yahoo, from AMB, Prologis. The person that has endowed my position at Stanford is the managing CEO of the biggest industrial real estate company in the world. The same way that Jewish diaspora helped modern Israel, new Israel, solve some of its early problems. I've been reading Ari Shavetz's book about Israel, and I was reading about some of the early problems in the first 8 or 9 years, the number of people who came, the unemployment rate, the number of poor exiles, and what helped solve that problem. Jewish diaspora was willing to help. Iranian diaspora, I think, might be able to help us transcend this problematic next phase, whenever it comes.
All right, so Richard, you're on.
Professor, you asked for it. So a question about the nuclear situation. There's so many different aspects. If you could speak to any part of it, sitting in Israel obviously has a different, more urgent dimension to it. But there's one particular aspect I'd appreciate you could comment on. What struck me in listening to all the different foreign ministers speaking before the cameras was the reoccurrence of a single word, respect.
Oh, we're recording. Okay, so I don't have to repeat everything. But it was the reoccurrence in every speaker of the core of the negotiation having to do with a respect for Iran. That it almost sounded as if that was dwarfing other considerations. So, any aspect of the circumstance you'd like to comment on, but that one in particular.
I think that's a great observation. What made these negotiations very interesting and complicated is that there were several parameters. The Iranians clearly wanted to make some concessions, but they needed to have those concessions more or less remain secret, or at least ambiguous. And they needed to be able to sell this at home as victory. Khamenei and the IRGC allies have invested simply too much financially, lost economic opportunity, psychologically, in this program to now say that we took the country to the abyss of bankruptcy and now are going to give up. They just can't say that. So what they need to do is to say the world has accepted our terms. Whereas if you actually read the text, they have virtually accepted every term that the world has demanded of them. Till a year ago, they basically said any concern about Iran's nuclear program is an American Zionist conspiracy. There's no reason to worry about it. Now they say the international community has a right to be concerned, and it is our responsibility to alleviate those. It is completely accepted the idea that 20% enrichment is to be stopped, that Fardu is not to go online. I mean, there are many, many aspects of it. But they can't sell this at home unless they can sell it as victory. Already, in the last 24 hours, I've been reading these rather blistering attacks on the agreement from the conservatives. One of them said it's a site that speaks for Khamenei often, and said this might well be one of the most shameful agreements ever signed in the history of Iran. It compares it to Turkmenchai, which is sort of the epitome of a colonial agreement. Now, there's obviously some posturing about that. I mean, the Iranian negotiators obviously want to be able to say, look what we have on our right wing, these people are accusing of us. But the complexity of the situation is that the regime needs to make concessions, but can only make concessions if it can sell it at home as victory. And the international community has to also worry about Israel's concern. It has to worry about some of its own past statements. It has to worry about UN resolutions. The UN resolutions, after all, said Iran must suspend all enrichment. So both sides have a very interesting dance, and I think both sides have decided to really leave all serious negotiations for the next 6 months, because virtually none of the most important issues have been resolved. For example, does NPT, Article 3 and Article 4 of NPT, does it give Iran the right to enrich uranium? Iran says it does. The US says it doesn't. Mr. Al-Baradei says it does. Many scholars say it doesn't. Everybody agrees that even if it does, if you cheat, you lose that right. So Iran has now virtually accepted that it has cheated, because it now says the international community has legitimate concerns. So to me, there are two issues. One is they need to sell this. The other issue is clearly the regime is in a very serious economic situation. And they want to get out of this as quickly as possible. They want to get out of it yesterday. I wrote an article in the New Republic. I said, an aspect of these negotiations nobody has talked about is that Iran hasn't just changed its tone, it has, in a sense, for now at least, changed its strategy. Rouhani is on record saying that our strategy for the last 20 years was to buy time, create reality on the ground, and then negotiate from a position of reality on the ground. Suddenly, their position now is, we don't have any time, let's sign an agreement yesterday. Why? Well, I think there are two reasons. One is they need sanction relief, and they need it immediately. And two is that they're very close to where they want to be, which is to have a virtual breakout capacity. And what this does, what this agreement does, I think, it freezes their development. There is no rollback in this. And whether they will be, how much of a rollback they will accept will depend on those negotiations. And what the Iranians obviously want to accomplish, and they might, is that they want to turn these temporary sanction reliefs into permanent ones. EU has already talked about lifting some sanctions on insurance, for example. So it might, what the Iranians are hoping is that what has been agreed will loosen the entire sanction regime, and countries and corporations will be lining up to invest in a very vast market.
All right. So the next person, I'm going to do this because he's right next to you. I'm going to change the order and have Tom go first, and then this gentleman in the back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your interesting introduction. I have basically...
Turn it on.
It is on.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Two questions. Do you see present developments as part of your relatively optimistic view on the developments in Iran? Hence, do you think that Rouhani recognizes these movements in the country and assumes that he has to accommodate them, and you see that as part of the process? So that's my first question. My second question is, what, in your opinion, can the outside world do more in order to change the regime? What can they contribute to a regime change?
Well, first of all, I think the second aspect is easier to answer. I'll answer that first. What I think the international community should do, and I've been saying this for last 10 years, the West should negotiate with Iran not just on nuclear issue. They should negotiate with Iran on nuclear and human rights. The example that I have often used is that they should emulate the model that Reagan and Schultz did with the Soviet Union. Nuclear talks in the morning, human rights in the afternoon. And they are inseparable from one another. And I think right now, the international community, for example, should have been a little more insistent. The man who, according to the regime, in the last election got 15 million votes, many of us believe that he actually won the election, is now for 1,000 days, almost, under house arrest with his wife and with the other candidate who they say won 500,000 votes. Why isn't the international community putting more pressure on these situations? I mean, I think it's a failure, a moral failure to say the only thing we'll negotiate with is on the nuclear issue. Iran, over the last 100 days, has executed close to 150 people. It's by far the largest number of any country. And nobody in the West seems to say a word about it. How many of you have even heard of the story? 150 over the last 100 days since Mr. Rouhani came to power. I don't think even Texas has done 150 in the last 10 years. No, 150? No, I live in you hear about it. This is a regime that has shown this aspect of it. So my sense is that the human rights situation in Iran must be receiving as much attention as these other aspects. It is a failure of moral responsibility to talk about these things and only worry about the nuclear issue. In terms of Rouhani, I have been reading a lot of Rouhani's writings. He's written several books. He's written 2 memoirs. He is a very, very clever, cunning, pragmatic, arrogant, clever man who is very good at self-preservation, but is also very good at recognizing where the political wind is. I think he knows that unless he distances himself from the status quo, he is not going to survive. But what might be his undoing is his overcaution. Because the way the right wing completely neutralized Khatami was go at it slowly, and one at a time. They, like snipers, they hit at some of his ministers. He didn't say anything. Advisors, he didn't say anything. They closed it. The magazines, Khatami didn't say anything. And they have begun to do some of this with him. On some issues, he has stood up to them. On some issues, he has backed down. Unless, I think, and many people think that Rouhani is essentially a Khamenei creation. I don't believe that. He is both a Khamenei creation and a Rafsanjani creation and a Khatami ally and someone who has played it cleverly enough that Iranian opposition, Iranian reformists, Iranian Democrats, Iranian women think that he might be their hope. What the Iranian people are trying to do is to do a regime change without changing the regime. And they think that Rouhani might be one tool in making this possible. Whether it will happen or not depends on a great deal of things, a great number of things. But if anybody can do it, Rouhani might be the man. He's really a very, very interesting case.
Over here, this gentleman.
I have 2 short questions, which was not asked here because most people ask about the nuclear activities and the foreign relation and the right, so I don't deal with this. I know everything about these points. But my 2 questions are the following. The first one concerning the Majlis. We know that Iran has a parliament, Majlis, but it is very limited in power. And it is approximately half dead. It is not active. It is not dealing with any political issues. But I would like Your Excellency to say something a little bit more details that I know about the Majlis, how it is elected, what is its authorities, to which extent it is dealing with corruptions or other things. And the second point concerning the contradiction between the clergy is preaching that women as half equal to half, and at the same time, most universities have 55% of its students, they are ladies. How they explain this, and if they are not afraid that so great masses of ladies who are becoming graduate with degrees, first degrees or second, and also how they are not afraid from them that they will once become a very mass movement and they will topple the regime. Thank you.
Yes, well, men don't always get what they want. The good thing about history, in fact, is that sometimes men don't get what they want, particularly when it comes to abusing women or denying them their rights. Women have proven to be, in Iran and as well as elsewhere, incredibly resilient, incredibly clever, and the Iranian women are the same. They sort of laugh at the clergy's idiocies. They sort of play around them. The regime has tried to stop them. It has tried to put limits. There is a virtual negative quota on women's enrollment in colleges, because I am told that if there was no negative quota, the number of women in colleges would be even greater. There was a discussion in the parliament, actually, in the Majlis that you want to know about, saying that all of these educated women are going to have only idiots to marry, and they're not going to be wanting to marry them. Who are they going to marry if they're more educated than men? Really, that's actually the subject of a discussion. If they are disproportionately more educated, who are they going to marry? So they are trying to put these negative quotas. They just passed the law last year, but the new administration has rescinded that law. Ahmadinejad's administration passed the law. They made 77 or 78, I don't remember the number, it's above 70, disciplines off limits to women. From mining engineering to developmental psychology. I mean, 70 different disciplines completely closed to women. That was an effort to make sure that men like them have uneducated women to marry. But women are not giving up. There are now more women poets, more women directors, more women publishers, more women truck drivers. It's just truly... Now, the Majlis is a very interesting phenomenon, because in the whole, if you think about it in terms of political theory, the idea of Velayat Faqih, the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the rule of Sharia, is incommensurate with the Majlis. Because, Sayyid Qutb in Egypt, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri in Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini said, we have all the laws we need. It's all in the Quran, and if it's not in the Quran, it's in some hadith, and divine laws are better than, and I'm virtually quoting Khomeini, he said, divine laws are better than laws made by syphilitic men. So if you have all the divine laws you need, why do you need a Majlis, which is supposedly to make laws? Khomeini found a very clever way. He said, we need Majlis to manage the laws. But now the Majlis has actually come into being, and they actually make some laws, like some of the laws that I mentioned. And the way they're elected is that they need to go through the vetting process, like everyone else. There is something called the Guardian Council. It has 12 men, all men. There are two very important bodies in Iran that is all men. One is the Guardian Council, which is like the virtual Supreme Court. The other one is the Council of Experts, 86 men who are supposedly the ones who elect or discover the leader. They're all men as well. So the 12-man body has to approve of you if you are going to run as a candidate. And once you are approved, then this becomes a very expensive proposition to get elected. It's very, very much, to me, it's very similar to, in some ways, to aspects of the apartheid system in South Africa. Once you are within the inner circle, then there's competition for political power. But if you're outside that circle, then it's impossible to even get on a ballot. Once you get on the ballot and you get elected, then the parliament has, first of all, certain very important functions. One of them is it needs to approve ministerial candidates. No minister can take position unless they pass the parliament vote of confidence. And they can impeach. They can also impeach president if the president doesn't work. And they have budgetary power. The amount of budget that is in the government's domain and not in the domain of the spiritual leader, they control. At one time, they tried to sort of muscle their way into the foundations controlled by the spiritual leader, and he slapped them back. He said, that's none of your business, stay out of this. So there is some power, but it's limited, and it's predominantly controlled at the center by the clergy.
This gentleman over here, and then you. Yes, first this gentleman, then you. Okay.
Professor Milani, first of all, thank you very much for the very illuminating talk so far. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more about the role of the Republican Guard as it pertains to the democratic dynamic that you spoke about. They are definitely a force to reckon with, and they have a symbiotic relationship with the clergy and the supreme leader. And surely they have a vested interest in resisting any changes, structural changes, as you talked about. So it would be interesting.
The Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, which is a very interesting phenomenon, created as a parallel military. Khomeini made a very interesting decision not to dissolve the military, although he thought the military was completely royalist. He decapitated the military. He fired, exiled, or killed all the generals, but he maintained it. But then he created a parallel military called the Revolutionary Guards, and increasingly empowered this IRGC with more budget, with more domain, and diminished the role of the traditional military. So the IRGC now has its own navy, its own air force, its own marines, its own special forces called the Quds Brigade, the city, the name of Jerusalem, led by a man who has become now something of a celebrity after The Guardian wrote about him, Haji Soleimani, saying that he is a kind of Le Carré kind of a character. And he is the one now said to be running actually the war in Syria. There are reports that he has been very active in bringing Hezbollah forces, bringing IRGC forces, and turning the tide of the war in Syria. And they have an enormous role in the economy. You're absolutely right that they are very much a pillar of this regime, but I don't believe that they are a monolithic unit. There's some very interesting data that has come out. For example, there's a neighborhood where they live, where these people live together, and the data about their voting behavior has been leaked. And in the district predominated by them in the two elections, Rouhani has won in this election, not their own candidate. The IRGC could not come up with one candidate. In the last election, IRGC could not come up coherent around one candidate. And the majority seemed to have voted for Rouhani, who was, by the time of the election, clearly the opposition candidate. He had sort of managed to place himself in that position. Will the IRGC fight to keep the status quo? I think they will. But they can, in my view, if they see the writing on the wall, and many of them clearly have seen the writing on the wall, they can understand that a kind of a pacted transition, similar to what happened, for example, in Chile, similar to what happened in Poland, for example, where they can keep what they have taken, but give up their political power, might be a way to ease into the next phase. In other words, keep them less as a political force, which they are now, and more as a corporatist entity and then gradually diminish their power. The only reason they win contracts is that they have political muscle. If you, in fact, have a private sector, for example, if you have foreign companies fairly competing with them. I mean, they bid on the security for Tehran airport, the new Khomeini airport. They lost the bid. On the day when a Turkish company was supposed to take over, the IRGC took over the airport and said, for security reasons, we can't allow this Turkish company to take over because there is a Zionist on its board. There was a Jewish businessman, American businessman, that was on the board of the company. So that's how they win contracts. That's one of the reasons they are very afraid that if trade sanctions are lifted, they would lose a lot of their revenue. One of their most important sources of revenue, Ahmadinejad famously said, is bringing in illegal contraband into Iran and selling it. They have their own, at least 13 known points of entry where they bring commodities in and don't pay any taxes, don't pay any tariffs, nobody controls them. They have their own airport. They have their own section of the airport where they bring in and take out anything they want. So they have a big stake in the status quo. But in my view, it could well be that they can be, as Godfather says, we make them an offer they can't refuse.
We have two more questions. First, this gentleman and this gentleman, please, sir.
What you described is very much the characteristics of the totalitarian democracy, with one very major difference to me is the religious aspect. And, to what extent do you expect, do you see their commitment to Islamize the world, or to force the world to be Shiite?
Shiism has been around for about 1,000 years, and there's still no more than 10-15% of the entire Islamic world, at most 20%. I talked about the IRGC. If you look at the name of the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, there's one word missing from it. Very critical word, Iran. It is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of where? Precisely of the world. There is a tendency, I think, there is very much a tendency amongst some of the clergy to see their mission as essentially a globalizing mission. As there is the same tendency, for example, in Sayyid Qutb's writing. Qutb really, when you get down to it and read his stuff, basically says the rest of the world is jahiliyyah and darkness, and it's our responsibility to bring light to them. But wishes don't always translate to reality. You need to have an alternative that works. I think right now in the Muslim world, the half-broken, and I really do believe it's already half-broken, but the half-broken Turkish model has much more appeal than the Iranian or the Muslim Brotherhood model. Both of those are failed models.
But the nuclear power in this respect may be the critical aspect of it. First of all, if Iran ever does take that next step, I think I would bet my last dollar that Saudi Arabia won't be far behind. Saudi Arabia already is said to have purchased some bombs from Pakistan that has Saudi Arabian name on it. So the idea that Iran, Shiite, non-Arab, Iran will be the only Muslim power with a bomb, to me, is an impossibility.
Elhanan. Microphone. Last question.
Yes. Do you think that the ethnic diversity of Iran will become a political problem?
Again, that is a great, great question. Iran, as some of you might know, is an ethnically diverse country. It has at least 20 to 25% who speak Turkish as their mother language. It has some 7 to 10% at least who speak Kurdish as their mother language. It has some maybe 4 or 5% who speak Arabic. It has another 4 at least to 7% who speak Baluchi as their language. There are Turkmens. They're a smaller minority. It's also religiously religious society. The majority are Shiites, but we have a small minority who are Sunnis. We have about 300,000 who are Baha'is. There are still 20,000 to 25,000 Jews who live in Iran. The part that is very much of concern to many Iranians is the ethnic, because I think there is this view in some in Iran, and I think some outside Iran, that what is happening in the Middle East is the beginnings of a redrawing of maps. That the maps of the Middle East were once drawn, and they were drawn rather presumptuously by French and British colonialists in 1919, 1920, without really due attention to what would work. I mean, to create Jordan, for example, because they needed some kingdom for Abdullah because he had been promised a kingdom, is not a way to draw maps. Or Iraq, the way they drew up Iraq. So some people see that there is a reconfiguration. Iraq, the Kurdish region of Iraq might be a magnet. All of these is a great deal of concern to many in Iran. And I think one of the reasons that people are very careful how far they push in trying to bring the regime change in a confrontational way is precisely because they're worried about this. The only way, in my view, that Iran's ethnic problems will be solved is, again, like the nuclear issue, is if Iran becomes a democracy. Unless, and the ethnic minorities in Iran, unless the religious minorities in Iran feel like they are equal citizens in a republic, then the tendency to go elsewhere will be increased. These people have lived together under the same general rubric of Iran for a very, very long time. There is an inclination, historic inclination, to stay together. But if the system fails to recognize their humanity, their equality, then I think the problems will, unfortunately, increase. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very, very much for a wonderful review. Thank you all for coming.